So what is the main difference between a traditional function and an arrow function? Well, the main difference is the difference in scope. It's how they handle scope. If you're new to JavaScript, and I assume you are if you're watching this video, this is going to be confusing, but don't worry, it just comes with experience. I didn't get it for like months. And so what is this? What does this mean? Well, this refers to the current context of the object. Everything in JavaScript is an object, and so everything has a scope, has this. Now, it's very hard to explain this concept verbally and even through drawing, so I'm just going to get right into the programming of it. And again, if you don't understand it, don't worry, it just comes with time. And so how am I going to illustrate or demonstrate the difference between a traditional function scope and an arrow function scope? I'm going to create two functions. I'm going to create the traditional function, and I'm going to create the arrow function, and then I'm going to create an object. And an object has the ability to create its own scope. Now, the default scope for any JavaScript program running in the browser is, when you type this, it gives us the window. What the object is going to do, it's going to create its own scope. And so we have a default scope. You can think of it as concentric rings like this. We have window as the default scope, the most outer scope, and the object has the ability to create its own scope like that, obj. All right, so let's get into it. So two functions. One's a traditional function. We'll just say function, and we'll name it trad function. And all these functions are going to do is they're just going to tell us they're this. They're going to tell us their scope. And we have an arrow function. We'll call it arrow function. And again, all these functions are going to do. If we have one line, we don't need the curly braces. They're just going to tell us they're this. And then I'm going to create that object. Let's say const, I'll just say my object is equal to, if you don't know what an object is, I did a video on it. I'll link it in the description. It's going to have two properties. It's going to have call trad, which is just going to call the traditional function, and it's going to have call arrow, which calls the arrow function like that. And so now pay attention to the what they output as their this. All right, so I'm going to call the traditional function and the arrow function from within the scope of the window here. Let's see what their scope is. So let's call the traditional function first. Now, the traditional function scope is the window. So the traditional function took on the scope of the window. Let's see the arrow function. The arrow function's scope is also the window. And so the arrow function took on the scope of the window. So these two guys were called, we called the traditional and the arrow function within the scope of the window. And they took on the scope of the window. Now, what happens when we call the arrow function or the traditional function and the arrow function within the object, and the object has its own scope? What are their scopes going to be? Well, if these two guys took on the scope of the window, if we call them within a different scope, their scopes should take on the scope of the object. Let's see if that's true. So we'll clear this out like this, and we'll just say my obj. We'll call the arrow function first. Call arrow. And arrow's scope is the scope of the window. And so arrow's scope, this guy here, this purple guy, his scope, we'll use right here, his scope was still the scope of the window. Let's call the scope of the traditional function. We'll say my object, my obj, dot call trad this time. And the traditional function's scope is call trad colon trad function call arrow. So what this block, this output is, that's the object's scope. Just giving you back all the properties of the object. And so when we called the traditional function from within the object's scope, it took on the object's scope. And so this is the main difference between a traditional function and an arrow a function. A traditional function takes on the scope of whatever scope calls it. So the object called the traditional function scope is the object. The window called the traditional function scope is the window. The arrow is always bound to the scope of the thing that created it. And so we created this arrow function here. We created it in window. So no matter where we call it, if we had another scope here, obj2, and we called the arrow function in here, no matter where we call the arrow function, since we defined the arrow function within the scope of the window, its scope is always going to be the window here. This is the main difference between a traditional function and an arrow function. It's how they handle their scope. Now, when would you use an arrow function over a traditional function? Well, one of the main use cases is in classes, when you're defining a class. And let me show you what I'm talking about. And so what I'm going to do to illustrate that is I'm going to create a class. And in that class, there's going to be some properties and some methods. If you don't know what a class is, I did a video on it. I'll link it in the description. I'm going to create the class. It's going to have some properties and some methods. Some of those methods are going to call other methods, and we're going to see how those methods are functions basically. So those methods behave like functions. We're going to see how scope gets handled. So let's stop talking. Let's do it. So class dog has a constructor like that. It's going to have a default name of Rex like that. Let's say a default height 4 like that. And it's going to have two methods. The dog is going to have the ability to bark. And so these are functions. This bark is a function. If you're defining a method, a function in a bark or in a class, you don't need the keyword function. In fact, if you put it, it breaks. So we're just going to have a function bark, and we're going to have a function called my catchphrase. And all my catchphrase is going to do, another function, it's going to return a string. It's going to return the dog's catchphrase. Say my name is Ruff, and then the dog's name, this dot name like that. All right, and all the bark is going to do is when we call the bark, it's going to tell us the catchphrase. So it's going to console log this dot my catchphrase, and we're going to call it like that. So now when we create a new dog like this, let's say const dog1 is equal to new dog. Let's call the bark. And the bark should call the my catchphrase, and we should get the catchphrase printed out. So dog1 dot bark. And we get my name is Ruffrex. Now we called this bark, which is a function, attached to this object. This is what this period is. It's object notation. And so bark knows that what called it is dog1. Now what happens if we separate bark from dog1 and we just call bark? So basically we're separating the function here. So we're going to take the function away from dog1. Let's say, let's just say gonna bark is equal to dog1 dot bark. And so now gonna bark has been assigned bark. We can still use dog1 dot bark, but now we can use gonna bark to access bark. Let's see what happens when we call gonna bark, and we get an error. Now why do we get an error? Again, this bark here, because of the object notation, this bark knows the scope of dog1. And so this function here, bark, on here on the left, its scope, because it was called attached to this object, its scope is the class dog. And so bark knows where this dot my catchphrase is. When we called it, when we took away the bark from the object and we just called the bark, because we called the function within the scope of the window has no idea what these things are. These things on the left belong to the object, not the window. They belong to dog. And so what we have to do is we have to bind this bark here, to this class. And so traditionally we did it like this. We said something like this dot bark is equal to this dot bark dot bind, and then this. So what we're saying is now we have a property just like name, height, and bark, and this property is equal to this bark. But because we bound it, this bark is always going to know, this bark is always going to know what the object is. So let me just show you. So now when we create the exact same dog, const dog1 is equal to new dog, and then we say dog1 dot bark, and again we're calling it with object notation, so bark obviously knows that it's part of this class here. We get My name is roughrex. Let's take the bark away from the dog one. Const, what did we say? Gonna bark. Gonna bark is equal to dog1 dot bark. And so now we're gonna run the function away from the object. And let's see if we get the same output. My name is roughrex. So because we bound, before we called the bark here, we bound it to the class. When you call this function, even within the window, it remembers the context, its scope of dog1. Now, this is how we bind a function to a constructor. But remember the arrow function. One of the main difference between an arrow function and a traditional function is that the arrow function, its scope is always bound to the scope you created it in. And so instead of doing this bark bind stuff, we can just make bark here an arrow function. And because it's defined within the class, bark will never forget where it came from. So that's the main difference between using a traditional and an arrow function. So we don't need the bind here, and we just convert this guy into an arrow function. And again, the arrow function scope is always bound to the scope that defined it. And so this bark is always going to be bound to dog. So now we create a new dog. Const dog1 is equal to new dog. We call the bark method. And now let's take the bark method away from the dog, and we call the bark method again, the gonna bark, and we get the same thing. So this is just the main difference. We're taking advantage of the fact that an arrow function its scope is bound to the scope that defined it. And so that's going to be it for this video. I had to make this video. I know it's confusing to new people, but again, it's irresponsible to make a video on my previous video on syntactical differences between a traditional function and a function, and then leave you guys trying to debug your code not knowing that their scopes behave differently. And so if this video made sense at all, if it helped you at all, don't forget to give a like, share, comment down below. Did you understand it? Was this a complete mess? Who knows? Subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. And I will see you guys in the next video.